Whatever way you cut it, firing a client often requires navigating difficult conversations and complicated emotions while balancing what is best for you and your business, making it one of the most challenging things you're likely to do as a business owner. In this video, I'm going to provide a juicy story about a time that I had to fire a client and it went really poorly, before going on to cover circumstances where I think it's appropriate to consider firing a client and provide you my recommended process that you should follow to make parting ways with a client easy, effective, and as painless as possible for everybody involved. Let's dive in. I wanted to talk a little bit about why firing clients is so hard in the first place. In my opinion, having to fire a client is really challenging because of all of the factors that go into it. On one hand, firing a client is strictly business. Deciding to part ways with a customer is sometimes the only option to protect you, your time, your business, and often most importantly, all of your other clients. While firing a client might be strictly business to you, on the other hand, firing a client can be intensely personal. The reason why I think this happens is that even in cases when you decide to fire a client you've only just started working with, there have already been multiple times where you've said yes to them and their project. Your business responded to that client's initial inquiry, sent them a proposal after an initial sales call, and countersigned their contract so work could formally begin. After hearing yes from your business a few times already, having your client hear that you now wish to end an agreement with them can make it really hard for them to not take it personally, regardless of the reason or clearly defined contractual obligations. You might be wondering, have I, Sam, ever fired a client before? The short answer is yes, nearly a dozen times. While the reasons for firing these clients were all totally justified, I handled a few of them pretty poorly. So I want to go into some details and help you learn from my mistakes. The slightly longer answer is that when I stepped into my first big client-facing role at the web design agency, I helped scale from 500 to nearly 5,000 paying clients and an eventual acquisition. My official title was Director of Customer Happiness. It's a little cheesy, I know, but it worked, and it really communicated what my job was because I was responsible for sales, yes, but also customer success. And this meant that I was typically the first person a new client spoke with after their initial inquiry. But also, I was the first line of defense for any serious issues or complaints. While 99% of the customers I worked with at this agency were friendly, collaborative, and all around amazing people, I eventually learned that no matter how effective your sales process is at properly vetting clients to ensure that they are a good fit, having to fire a client is inevitable at some point. And you're not going to be perfect every time as you're vetting new clients you take on, no matter what systems you have in place. Because it's inevitable that at some point you're going to have to fire a client, I think that everyone should be prepared to do so before the need arises. To help illustrate why I think it's so important to have a process for firing clients, I want to go into a little story about the time that I had to fire a real life client, what happened and how poorly it went because we didn't have a set process in place. So let's run it back to 2017. I was a young buck. I just stepped into this Director of Customer Happiness role, and I was just kind of flying by the seat of my pants. People were really happy. I was having a great time connecting with new people and helping to provide a service that I not only really believed in, but I thought provided tremendous value to each and every client that we took on. But not every client can be a perfect fit. And I want to tell you a story about that. For this example, I've changed the name and business information of this client, and I'll refer to them only as Charlie. When Charlie first contacted us about their project, I was the one to speak with them. During our initial sales conversation, it appeared to be a typical project for our agency, building a website for a private practice specializing in animal-assisted therapy. Not only was the mission of this business commendable, but they also seemed like a perfect fit for us as a client. That said, hindsight is 2020, and there were two things that Charlie asked during the initial sales call that I probably could have dug deeper into or clarified. During our call, the first thing Charlie asked was if there was a limit to the number of pages we could create. Later on in the call, Charlie also asked if unlimited website edits truly meant unlimited. Now, I want to provide some additional background into those two questions, because at this point in our agency's existence, we had openly communicated that the number of pages we could create and the number of edits we could make to a website were 100% unlimited, no questions asked, I think at this time, both of those things were even included like in our terms of service. So it was totally baked into our process and what we were doing. Eventually, we ended up adding some more guardrails, but I didn't really have any reason to at the time. So fast forward a week or so, and after the project kicked off, Charlie completed our standard web design questionnaire. Shortly after, our team sent them a first draft of their new website. When building the first draft of a website, at our agency, we focused on nailing down the overall design, colors, fonts, imagery, etc. And in order to maximize our effectiveness, we would only initially design 3 to 4 pages and communicate to the client that we could always add additional pages once the design was finalized. So we sent this first draft to Charlie. After seeing the first draft that we sent them, Charlie communicated that while the web design looked okay as a starting point, the rest of the website was completely wrong and that they would follow up with a list of revisions for us to make. Okay, no problem. We thought revisions, totally normal, happen all the time. We'll knock those out. We'll get this project back on track and make the client happy. Now is when things get juicy. You can probably imagine our surprise when Charlie sent us a Google Drive folder with 97 additional pages they wanted us to add to the website. If you build websites for clients, this might sound like a nightmare to you. To us, not only was this a massive request, but at this point in the evolution of WordPress, where we were building all of our websites on at this time, the WordPress platform had a 99-page limit, meaning that even if we wanted to create all of these pages for Charlie, it wasn't possible at a technical level. What was even more problematic is that while Charlie provided the content for some of these pages, they also wanted us to proofread every single page, which we did communicate that we did not do. As you can imagine, it was at this point that we quickly realized Charlie was probably not a good fit. And as our agency's director of customer happiness, I jumped in to effectively fire them. In the back of my head, I was thinking, okay, they might be a little bit upset that we want to part ways with them, but we'll offer them a full refund. It'll all be good. And our team is going to be a lot less stressed because they don't have to do this massive project. I wrote Charlie an email explaining the WordPress page limit and the fact that we did not offer proofreading services. Because of these two factors, we probably weren't a good fit for the project, but we would provide a full refund plus my personal recommendations for alternative services. In my mind, this one email was enough to resolve the entire situation. This is where I messed up pretty bad. Not only did I think that this one email would be enough to quickly resolve the situation, but I'd also sent that email at the end of the day. At this time, being earlier in my career and saying, that's a problem for tomorrow, Sam. Because I sent it at the end of the day, I missed 3 calls from Charlie and come back in the next morning to a very upset email. In this email, Charlie pointed out that while they could accept that we didn't offer proofreading for website copy, we openly advertised that we provided unlimited page creation and unlimited website edits. And Charlie pointed out, I had actually reaffirmed this on the call when they had asked. Because of these things, Charlie said, it could only be a personal reason for insisting that we now want to part ways. And Charlie made it really clear that if we couldn't come to an agreement, they would post negative reviews online and communicate to every person they knew how unethical our business practices were. Well, there are some cases where firing a client can be cut and dry. In this example, Charlie hadn't actually done anything wrong. There was never any foul language or outright contract violations. And at the end of the day, the fault rested solely on our agency for not better defining our unlimited page creation and website edits. And then it was on me, compounding the issue by sending a quick "see you later" email at the end of the day, instead of having a conversation with Charlie where I could explain our missteps and hopefully come to a more amicable resolution. Ultimately, we had no choice but to agree to complete Charlie's project, incurring a huge cost and requiring many additional hours of work. But it was our mistakes that got us into this situation, and it was our responsibility to make it right. So we ended up agreeing that we would create all of their additional pages up until that 99-page limit that was the limitation of WordPress, and that we would provide as many edits as they wanted, but we did not offer proofreading services. That said, if we had put a process in place before firing a client and getting into the situation, it would have saved us a significant amount of time, money, and frustration for everyone involved. So in the next part of this, I want to go into my top 3 situations where you might consider firing a client to help you better define the situations where it may be appropriate to fire a client in your own business, and understand that ahead of time so you know that you're firing a client for the right reasons and don't jump to fire a client too quickly. Another little tidbit of advice. As a business owner, you can decide who you do and do not work with. You have the full authority to do that. But you can also structure your contracts in a way that allows you to fire a client for a wide range of reasons, and sometimes even terminate a client agreement at any time. That said, I'm not a lawyer and this is not legal advice, but here are my top 3 scenarios where it may be appropriate to fire a client that you can also consider adding to your contracts or terms of service. The first scenario where it's appropriate to fire a client is when they use inappropriate or abusive language. This one out of any of these scenarios is super cut and dry. Listen, we're all humans. Delays and mistakes will happen. That is inevitable at some point. That said, I firmly believe it is never acceptable for a client to use inappropriate or abusive language towards me or any of my team members. This type of behavior is not only unprofessional, but it also creates a hostile work environment. That said, it's up to you as a business owner to decide how you want to handle occurrences of abusive or inappropriate language. For me, typically the way that I decide, hey, should this be a warning or should we fire the client? Any foul language used when referencing a team member's work is cause for a single written warning. For example, if the client says this design or this website looks like one strike, but after that, they're out. In contrast, any language that is targeted specifically at a team member is grounds for immediate termination of a client agreement. Any name calling, anything directed towards a team member with any sorts of foul language, those are things where that's it, you're done, you're out. And this is also something that is honestly pretty easy to work into a contract. And I find that most of the design agencies I talk to have this already. In the circumstances where a client does use inappropriate or abusive language, it is essential to document the issue in detail and save any electronic copies of that communication. The second scenario where you might consider firing a client is if they consistently make late payments or refuse to pay. Late payments or refusal to pay can be a significant issue for any design agency. Not only does it impact your ability to pay your team and maintain your business, but it also creates a stressful working environment. It's important to have clear payment terms outlined in your contracts and agreements, as it can help prevent misunderstandings and provide a basis for action if a client is consistently late or refuses to pay. In general, I like to give a little bit of wiggle room there because sometimes there can be misunderstandings. Sometimes credit cards expire, they don't see invoices, things like that. I typically like to give that 1 to 2 weeks and send a few reminder emails before taking action to part ways with that client. This is another one where documentation is huge. Make sure that you have any electronic copies of communications where they refused to pay or they said they didn't have to pay on the schedule that you outlined. But even more so, make sure that you're really clear about this in your sales call and your initial communication with clients. The better you can set expectations, the better your outcomes will be across the board. The third situation where it may be appropriate to fire a client is if the client simply isn't a good fit. The scenario when you might want to fire a client for not being a good fit is often one of the toughest to navigate because it's less cut and dry than the first two. What makes it even more complex is that it's often something really challenging to include in any sort of written contract or agreement. A client you need to fire because they aren't a good fit can happen for several reasons, such as different design styles or difficult or incompatible working styles. And as you can probably imagine, there's a lot of gray area in there. But that said, it can still be a totally justified reason for wanting to part ways with a client, as things like not being able to come to a consensus on a design style can eat up other time that you wanted to spend working on other clients' projects. Before deciding to fire a client that is not a good fit, I recommend having an open and honest conversation with them. Talk about what their expectations were, how they think it's going. Make sure you ask questions and then listen to those answers. Treat this type of situation a lot more gently. Talk about what you've done already to try and come to a resolution and offer them a ton of support in finding a new agency so they can transition from working with you to working with somebody else really easily. Well, these are just a couple scenarios where you might want to fire a client. These are the 3 that stand out to me the strongest. and all reasons why I've had to fire clients before. Well, it's ultimately up to you to decide as a business owner what situations you deem appropriate for firing a client. Whatever you decide, it's important to have a process in place for firing a client. And I want to talk about my general recommendations for how you can create a process that's going to help you part ways with clients in a way that's the least likely to generate problems down the road, and in the best cases, even make it a really amicable split. It's important to remember, when you do decide to fire a client, you are doing so because continuing to work with that client puts your business's financial health or overall well-being at risk. And it's your responsibility as a business owner. You owe it to yourself, your colleagues, and all of your other clients. That said, just because you have a responsibility to put your business first doesn't mean you can just say, okay, we're done, bye. Rushing to fire a client too quickly or without a plan of action can negatively impact your reputation with your current and future clients, and in worst case scenarios, may even result in legal action against your business. I want to give you my suggestions for things you should do before you fire a client, as well as additional steps you can take after you decide to part ways. Before I ever seriously consider taking steps to fire a client, the first question I like to ask myself is, what is the ideal outcome to this situation? This was a piece of advice that somebody had shared with me a while ago, and they said, going into any conversation with the client, especially ones that could potentially be a little bit confrontational or emotional, ask yourself, how do I want this to end up? What's the best result for everybody involved? You may discover that you don't actually need to part ways, and that there's things that you can do to get the project back on track and make your working relationship better for everybody involved. The reason why thinking of your ideal outcome ahead of time is so powerful is that it makes sure you're not jumping into action too quickly to fire a client just because you are having a bad day or overwhelmed with a lot of simultaneous projects and things you need to do at once. It's really easy to get stressed out as a business owner, and I think taking that step back can help you take more intentional steps without necessarily firing the client, and in bad scenarios, help you part ways quicker and more effectively. If it is possible to resolve the situation without firing a client, my next advice is that you should consider scheduling a time to speak with them directly. What this does is help prevent your client from jumping to conclusions or misunderstanding what you have to say. This was one thing I had wished that I would have done in the example that I shared earlier. If I simply set up a call to ask them about what their expectations were for the project and whether or not they think we're meeting them and how we could get better, it probably would have resulted in either allowing us to part ways without any hard feelings, or trim down the scope of the project a little bit so that we weren't putting in unnecessary hours and spending additional resources trying to get their website up and running. Throughout my time working with clients, I've been frequently surprised how effective conversations like these are for finding a middle ground before having to part ways and then deal with navigating complicated conversations that can come as the result of telling your client that you need to part ways. My last thing that you should consider doing before you fire a client is determine whether a written warning is appropriate. There are some cases, things I talked about earlier, that a written warning may be appropriate before officially firing them. Sending warnings like these, in my experience, can be the only thing that you need to get a project back on track. Because in your client's eyes, they know that you have this documented and they know that this problem arises again, you have the right to fire them. In situations where you determine that there is no resolution, there's no way that you can continue working with the client, I want to share the things that I recommend that you do to protect yourself, your business, but also hopefully part ways with your client on the best of terms possible. The first thing you need to do after you decide to fire a client, and before you communicate to them that you need to part ways, is make sure you have proper documentation. This step I cannot recommend enough. Proper documentation is critical for you to be able to part ways with the client effectively, but also avoid any potential negative outcomes that might arise from the situation. The documentation you'll want available generally includes things like specific parts of your contract or agreement that details when you have the right to fire a client, documentation about the steps you've taken to try and resolve the issue, copies of any electronic communication that provides evidence as to why you are firing the client. And finally, you'll also want to have additional documentation that explains the rights of your clients after you part ways. For example, what they get to take away from the project, whether that's logo files or wireframes, as well as any refund that they might receive. After you have all of your documentation together and you're ready to notify the client that you're needing to part ways, I recommend just taking a step back before you send them anything. And remind yourself to keep it professional. Firing a client is a business decision. And while personal feelings can arise from some of the conversations you might have, at the end of the day, you're doing what's best for your business, for your team, and you need to stand by that. Make sure your client knows why you've made this decision and why it's necessary for the health of your business. And even though it's challenging, try avoiding getting emotional or irritated in any of your conversations with your client before or after you decide to part ways. Charged emotions can often create an opposite and equal reaction that draws the process of firing a client out even longer. When you get emotional or irritated, your client's gonna do the same, and you're gonna get in this back and forth that sometimes can take a couple weeks to resolve. When I have to fire a client, I often tell myself to focus on the facts, not the feelings. And the reason why I say this to myself is it's helped me keep a level head and maintain a high level of professionalism throughout challenging conversations. Finally, on the note of keeping it professional, in situations where you are parting ways with a client that is not a good fit, make sure to offer them support in finding an alternative service, as things like that can go a really long way in leaving a lasting positive impression. After you have the proper documentation and you've reminded yourself to keep it professional, now's the time to send the client written notice that you are needing to part ways. When finally telling a client that you're parting ways, I suggest that you send this communication via email, as telling them on a live call can open up a whole host of additional variables. Plus, sending notice via email means that you have a backup of the communication in your sent folder. I recommend your final notice to a client informing them of the decision to part ways include a clear summary of why you're choosing to end your agreement, supporting documents such as contracts or terms of service, written documentation about actions you have taken in attempt to rectify the situation, a timeline for when the work with the client will end, and details about what happens after your work together ends, such as anything that you will return to the client, like design assets or a monetary refund. So that does it. Well, from my experience, needing to fire a client is rare. You need to be prepared for when the situation arises. Because if you're in business long enough and work with enough clients, the situation will come up.